It was the golden age of airline hijackings. Armed groups would storm a plane, make outrageous demands, and leave governments scrambling to respond. So when German and Palestinian extremists seized an Air France flight packed with Israelis, no one was sure whether Israel would negotiate or strike back. Every option carried a body count. The hijackers diverted the plane to Uganda, whose bloodthirsty dictator hated Israel. Then they made their demands: $5 million and the release of prisoners. If Israel didn't comply within the week, they'd blow up the plane with everyone in it. The Israeli government spent that week locked in debate, the stakes rising by the hour. One wrong move could cost more than 100 lives. On July 4th, 1976, the Israeli government finally issued its response. Just after midnight, Israeli commandos burst into Entebbe airport, shouting in Hebrew, "Stay down, we're here to bring you home." Panic erupted as the crack of gunfire and grenades split the air. 90 minutes later, the plane was headed back to Israel. So how did Israelis pull off the legendary raid on Entebbe? The early 70s were rough for Israelis. First came the Munich Olympics, where a Palestinian terror group murdered 11 Israeli athletes on live TV as the world gaped in horror. A year later, the devastating surprise of the Yom Kippur War cost nearly 3,000 Israeli lives. Shortly after that, a terror group murdered 25 Israeli school children and their teachers. And then there were the skyjackings, the most attention-grabbing and high-stakes tactic of all. Today, El Al is famous, or maybe infamous, for its rigorous security protocols. It's the only commercial airline in the world whose fleet is equipped with anti-missile systems, reinforced cockpit doors, undercover sky marshals, and flight attendants trained in Krav Maga. But that wasn't always the case. 8 years before the rescue operation in Entebbe, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine rerouted an Israeli plane to Algeria, keeping the Israeli passengers as human bargaining chips for the next 40 days, until Israel and Algeria struck a deal. It was the longest airline hijacking in history. It was also El Al's last, because after that, Israel's national airline got serious about security, which meant that even during the golden age of airline hijackings, Israelis felt safe flying El Al, and they knew that their government had rigid security protocols for any flight originating in Tel Aviv, no matter the airline. So 8 years later, when an Air France plane took off from Tel Aviv, there were no hijackers on board, just 200-odd passengers, mostly Israelis and Jews, en route to Paris. But the Israelis had no control over the security on connecting flights, and some airports were more lax about security than others, especially Elinikon International Airport in Athens, which was famous for its sloppy screening procedures, which made it very easy for the 4 hijackers to board the plane when it touched down in Greece. 2 of the hijackers were German, from the far-left revolutionary cells, which often collaborated with Palestinian terror groups. In this case, they were working with 2 Palestinians from the PFLP. Their mission? Hijack the plane and use the Israeli and Jewish passengers as ransom for dozens of prisoners in Israel, West Germany, and Kenya. 8 minutes after takeoff, pilot Michel Bacos heard screams. Seconds later, a young stranger slipped into the cockpit. Wilfried Boss looked like any other 20-something in the 70s. Longish hair, unkempt goatee, a stylish corduroy suit, except for the pistol and grenade in his hands. He pressed the gun to the pilot's neck. "Change of plans," he announced. "We're going to Libya." Captain Michel Bacos had served in the Free French forces during World War II, battling Axis and Vichy forces. He knew how to keep his cool under fire, but he had never flown a plane for 7 hours with a gun aimed directly at him. If Captain Bacos so much as moved his head, he'd find Boss's gun jammed into the back of his neck. Still, he betrayed no fear. As Captain Bacos rerouted the plane, the other 3 hijackers got down to business. In broken English and bad French, they herded all the first-class passengers to the back of the plane, prodding them with pistols and grenades if they moved too slowly. When a small, elderly Jewish man tried to resist, all 3 hijackers fell on him, pummeling him until he lay still. Other passengers debated resistance. It was 200 against 4, but then the hijackers brought out boxes stuffed with dynamite, and even the most hardened passenger realized they had no way out. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. "Do what we tell you, and no one gets hurt," he said. None of the Israelis believed him. The PFLP was bold and highly trained. They specialized in skyjackings, though when they couldn't get on a plane, they'd simply target the airport. Even among Palestinians, they had a reputation for extremism. First, they separated children from their parents, making it harder for the passengers to resist. Holocaust survivors who had been separated from their own mothers and fathers were now reliving the same experience, this time with their own kids. Then they began searching the passengers for weapons, an arduous, humiliating process that went way beyond a mere pat-down. And then came the moment the Israelis had been dreading. The hijackers demanded everyone's IDs. A handful of Israelis on the plane had dual citizenship, and some did their best to destroy their Israeli ID cards, but most handed over all their documentation, some out of fear of what would happen if they didn't, and some out of a refusal to hide their Israeli identity. The hours passed. Nerves grew short. The hijackers never stopped issuing orders or yelling when they found the passengers too unruly. Finally, it was time. As the plane circled the Benghazi airport, Bose warned Bacos to land gently so he didn't shake the dynamite on board. Bacos landed gently. Nothing blew up. A Libyan official entered the plane with hugs and kisses for the hijackers, and an ironic welcome for everyone else. "Welcome to the Arab Republic of Libya," he said. "I'm sorry you had to come here like this." So were the passengers. One couple decided to do something about it. A British-Israeli woman who had been en route to Europe for her mother's funeral refused to let a stupid hijacking get in the way of her plans. Screaming in pretend agony, she faked a miscarriage. She and her husband were allowed to go free only because the hijackers had no idea they were Israeli. When she landed in London a day later, she gave Scotland Yard and the Mossad all the information she remembered about the hijackers. But a trick like that would only work once, so the rest of the passengers waited anxiously on the tarmac as the plane refueled for the next leg of its journey. 6.5 hours later, they were wheels up again, with no idea where they were going. Even pilot Michel Bacos didn't know their destination until it was time to land. Their destination was Uganda, which was ruled by a charming, ruthless, and possibly insane dictator named Idi Amin Dada, though he preferred the nickname Big Daddy. His people, however, knew him as the Butcher of Uganda, and the Israelis, they knew him as a real piece of work. Since its independence, Uganda had maintained friendly relations with Israel. The Israelis had even trained and donated weapons to the Ugandan forces. My grandfather actually trained with Idi Amin Dada in Israel, and the Israelis helped develop much of Uganda's infrastructure, including the airport where Air France Flight 139 was about to land. The Israeli architects had never imagined that their blueprints would one day become a key component of the most daring rescue operation in history. But Idi Amin's warm relationship with Israel soured quickly. When the Israelis refused to send him free weapons, he expelled every Israeli from Uganda, persecuted his country's tiny Jewish community, cozied up to Gaddafi, and even started praising the former German Führer.
Hitler's problem is now past tense. Now we are looking forward for the future generations and a future plan.
Shortly after Flight 139 touched down in Entebbe, after more than 24 hours of travel, Idi Amin himself showed up to greet the passengers. Every day he'd arrive in a different elaborate outfit and tell the Israelis stories of his time in Israel. He started and ended each visit with a hearty "Shalom" and then waited for applause. The captives complied. What else could they do? They were being held by the PFLP in a faraway country run by a dictator with a brutal reputation. Their captors had just announced that if the Israeli government didn't meet their demands, none of them would leave Uganda alive. Within a few days, Bose and his PFLP cronies had separated the Israeli and Jewish passengers from everyone else. Some Jews escaped what they called the selection, borrowing the German term for the separation of prisoners in the extermination camps. Shortly afterwards, the PFLP let the non-Israeli passengers go, though they kept most of the Jewish passengers regardless of nationality. As soon as they were released, some passengers met with intelligence agents from multiple countries, eager to provide all the details they could on their captors. They had no idea that the IDF would later use this information to rescue the remaining 102 captives. They couldn't have known about the top-secret, wildly audacious plan unfolding in Jerusalem. They couldn't have known that in a matter of days, elite Israeli commandos would finally get the green light for a mission so bold it sounded fantastical. But as the PFLP taunted and abused their captives, the Israeli military was working on a plan so secret that even the Prime Minister didn't know about it. The Prime Minister had originally favored negotiations. After all, Uganda was 3,000 miles away and led by an unhinged dictator. The airport was surrounded by Idi Amin's troops, many of whom had been trained by the Israelis themselves. And then there were the PFLP operatives to worry about, not to mention all their dynamite. But those were surmountable obstacles. There was another, much more important reason for Rabin to be wary, and that was Israel's dismal track record with rescues. At the Munich Olympics, the Germans had refused Israel's help, and 11 Israeli athletes had been murdered on live TV. 2 years later, Israeli special forces had stormed a school in northern Israel, where a different Palestinian terror group was holding hundreds of children. But without any information about the school's layout, they lost precious seconds that the terror operatives used to simply blow up a classroom with students inside. Everyone who saw the aftermath remained haunted for the rest of their lives. The same special unit that had failed to bring the children home alive was now expected to fly thousands of miles to rescue more than 100 captives from a heavily armed and fortified airport in a country run by a guy who hated them. Of course, the Prime Minister was nervous. If this mission failed, he would never forgive himself. But his defense minister and longtime bitter rival had no intention of negotiating. He too was haunted by the tragedy of the school children, but he refused to let the failures of the past dictate the course of the future. Plus, he trusted his top men. 31-year-old veteran and special forces rock star Muki Betzel, who had actually trained the Ugandan soldiers he would now have to fight, and 30-year-old elite commander Yoni Netanyahu. Yoni was a legend among the top brass, though it was his younger brother, Benjamin, who would one day be Israel's longest-serving prime minister. But in July of 1976, all of that was in the future. The only thing on Yoni's mind was making sure the mission would succeed. After a week of poring over airport blueprints and analyzing every scrap of information they had, the top secret squad took their plan to the prime minister. He could have refused to even look at it, annoyed at their insubordination. But Rabin had also been an elite commander once. He knew a good plan when he saw it. And this was a good plan. Well, aside from the fact it was completely unprecedented and possibly insane. Hundreds of commandos spread across 4 military transport planes and accompanied by 2 passenger planes would fly 2,500 miles, staying less than 100 feet above ground so that no radar would detect them. They would bring a black Mercedes, just like the one Idi Amin drove, so that they could pretend they were simply escorting the president on a late-night visit to the airport. They planned a fast, precise strike, rush the airport, avoid confronting Ugandan troops, eliminate the hijackers, rescue 102 captives, load them all on planes, then let the cleanup crew destroy the airfield so that they couldn't be pursued. Easy peasy. The team of commandos knew that they might not all survive, and the Israeli government prepared for a significant number of casualties. Despite the risks, however, the prime minister had no intention of negotiating. He refused to release security prisoners who were responsible for some of the worst terror campaigns in Israeli history. Doing so would further demoralize an already dispirited nation. Plus, the operation's dress rehearsal had gone off without a hitch. So as the clock ticked down to the deadline, he okayed the mission. Yoni Netanyahu had not expected the prime minister to give the green light, but as the clock struck 3:30 on July 3rd, 1976, he found himself in a military plane less than 100 feet above the sands of the Sinai Desert, headed towards the most important mission of his career. Less than 8 hours later, he was in Uganda, gliding through the night in the black Mercedes they had brought to mimic Idi Amin. But the Israelis didn't know that Amin had recently swapped his black Mercedes for a white one, so they weren't prepared for a Ugandan soldier to point his rifle at the car. They had orders not to engage the Ugandan troops, but Yoni worried that they had just lost the element of surprise, so he leaned out the window and shot. Thanks to advanced silencers, the motion was soundless, but the shot wasn't lethal, and the soldier got to his feet and shot back. The night exploded in a hail of bullets, and the only option the Israelis had now was to move fast. Before the entire airport exploded into a ball of fire, the captives could hear the firefight outside, but they had no idea what was happening. All they knew was that suddenly, their guards had their rifles out and they weren't pointed at the door. It seemed they were about to preempt the 2 p.m. deadline and shoot all the hostages here and now. Until the Israelis burst in, guns blazing. One of the PFLP guards threw a smoke grenade, setting fire to the mattresses on which the captives were cowering. Terrified, one of the captives stood up to avoid the fire. This moment of caution cost him his life, because he was accidentally shot by an Israeli commando. And the commando's orders were to shoot first and ask questions later. So when someone jumped up, they shot. and so did the remaining guards. The young man never had a chance. In the chaos of the firefight, the commandos forgot that they had brought a megaphone with them. After nearly taking out 2 more captives, they remembered they could communicate. One commando raised the megaphone to his mouth and shouted in Hebrew, "Stay down, we're IDF." As the captives ran towards the plane, they were strafed by a hail of bullets coming from a control tower. Without hesitating, the Israelis returned fire, destroying the tower with an RPG. After that, there were no more bullets. The raid had taken place in the hours before dawn, and most of the captives were half-dressed at best. They looked disheveled, shell-shocked, in pajamas or underwear, hardly daring to believe that they were safe. But not all the captives made it out. 3 had been shot, 1 by Israeli forces, 2 by the guards, and a 4th hadn't been in the airport at all. Earlier that day, an elderly Israeli woman had choked on a chicken bone and been taken to the hospital. Her son now pleaded with the Israelis to save her, but they shook their heads. "We can't do anything about it now," they said. "Our orders are to take off as soon as everyone has been evacuated." But the man who was supposed to be giving the orders was silent. Mission Commander Yoni Netanyahu had taken a bullet in the initial firefight and had bled out before he could even be loaded onto the plane. He was the only military casualty. As the plane climbed into the sky, Muki Betzel looked down at the receding landscape. Just a few years earlier, he had been among the Israelis expelled by Idi Amin. Now, he was leaving not in sadness and confusion, but in triumph, having pulled off the impossible in just 50 minutes. The captives were free, but the remaining Israeli team had more to do, like blowing up every plane in the airfield. Mission accomplished, they took to the sky, leaving the nightmare behind. But for some, the nightmare was just beginning. Because when Idi Amin found out about the raid, he went ballistic. First, he murdered a number of his own soldiers, certain they had collaborated with the Israelis. Because the Kenyans had allowed the Israelis to refuel in their territory, he murdered hundreds of unlucky Kenyans who happened to live in Uganda. Thousands more Kenyans fled, terrified they would be next. And when he learned that one Israeli captive, a woman in her 70s, had been left behind in a hospital in Uganda's capital city, he had her disposed of, too. But no one knew that yet. So when the planes finally landed in Israel, they were greeted by a riot of celebration. The non-Israeli captives, including the Air France crew, were put up in lavish hotels and welcomed as heroes. The mission had undoubtedly succeeded, but a pall hung over the crowd. 5 families would never get their loved ones back, and Israel had just lost one of its most promising soldiers. When the defense minister heard about Yoni's loss, he had to turn his face away so no one would see his tears. The raid of Entebbe soon became the stuff of legend. Jews around the world stood a little straighter, and Israel entered the latter half of the 1970s with renewed pride and morale. Most Western nations commended the raid, and though a number of countries wanted to condemn the Jewish state, the UN Security Council blocked the vote. Hours after the operation, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin stood before the Knesset and announced the success of the mission as a remarkable manifestation of Jewish fraternity and Jewish valor. The opposition leader described the soldiers as Maccabees, risen anew. The raid had long-term effects too. Many German leftists were appalled to hear that their comrades had participated in a Nazi-esque selection separating Jews from non-Jews. Leftists like Bose had made common cause with radical groups precisely because they were so scarred from what the Nazis had once done to their country. It turned out that very little separated one extremist ideology from the other. The raid was the beginning of the end for Idi Amin too. Just a few years later, his government fell to Ugandan rebels. But Idi Amin managed to escape justice, taking refuge in Saudi Arabia, where he lived out the rest of his days. The PFLP later blew up an Israeli-owned hotel in Kenya, costing 20 lives. But by that time, Israel had already neutralized their leader, assassinating him with poisoned toothpaste. Israel had set a precedent: do not negotiate and do not pay ransom. Other countries began to follow their lead, setting up special ops rescue teams like Delta Force. The golden age of hijackings was not yet over, and Western countries had ample opportunity to embark on their own rescue missions, with mixed success. The legend of Entebbe has inspired countless films, books, and similar operations, and turned Yoni Netanyahu into a household name, propelling his brother's political career. But more importantly, it became a symbol of the risks Israel was willing to take to rescue Jewish men and women from harm. A commitment that has been significantly challenged by the catastrophe of October 7th and the Israel-Hamas war, but still endures to this day.